evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth roundtable of ISA's International Conference on South Asia 2022. This session is titled Integrating New States and will explore how India and Pakistan try to control and regulate cross-border and refugee movement by instituting a visa and passport regime, altering the sense of citizenship and legal belonging. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate it if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via this chat. The questions will be consolidated for the speakers to answer later. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following distinguished speakers: Professor Sajal Nag, Professor in History, Assam University; Dr. Yaqub Khan, Fulbright Fellow, the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, Harvard University; and Dr. Hemanti Roy, Associate Professor, College of Arts and Science, University of Dayton, Ohio. I now invite Associate Professor Gyanesh Kudesia, Visiting Research Associate Professor, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and Associate Professor, South Asia Studies Program, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, NUS, to chair the session. Prof. Kudesia, please.
Thank you, Winnie, and welcome to this fourth roundtable of this year's ISIS's annual conference, which is focused on integrating princely states. So this is a very special roundtable because we have had this is the third day of the conference, and we've had very wide-ranging discussions on diplomacy, on cross-border issues, and so on. But this is a special one because it deals with firstly, it's a special one for two reasons. Firstly, personally for me, because I'm in the company of panelists whose work I admire greatly. That's one reason. The second reason is that this is on two issues, which are, the first one is rather neglected, which is really the role of princely states, how the princely states were integrated, the complexities and challenges of integrating them in the comparative context of India and Pakistan. So this is one of the objectives of this panel, of this roundtable. And the second objective is really the control and regulation of cross-border refugee movements, particularly by instituting visa and passport regimes, which was done from the late 1940s into the 1950s and beyond. And this, of course, altered the sense of citizenship and belonging. So we have three experts talking about these issues and talking about them in different geographies. Professor Nag, who will be talking about mainly the Northeast, which I think has increasingly become more important in the studies of partition and its aftermath, and very rightly so. And then Dr. Roy, who will be talking more generally about citizenship, and of course, Dr. Yaqub Khan Bangash, who will be talking about princely states in Pakistan. So without further ado, I think you have all had the biographical details about the three speakers, which have been circulated already. Without further ado, I would request Professor Sajal Nag to make your presentation. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thanks to the chair and greetings to all my co-panelists. Without much ado, let me go into the thing. I'll just reading some of the PPTs. Kindly go through it. Sometimes I may not be following the PPTs, but you can read the PPTs for the details because time is very short. I can't really cover everything. So let's see how far we can go. The Indians were trying to expel the British from their country for over a country, yet when the British actually announced its exit from India, it resulted in a massive crisis, shattered dream of one united India. There is an impending partition of India into separate nations. There are nearly about 600 native states threatening to revert to their independent states, and some tribal areas of Northeast India contemplating withdrawal from India on the ground as they were not Indian. During the partition debate, and especially the boundary commission debate, if you read through once the process of partition has started, it had become more about grabbing as much land as possible and less about Hindus and Muslims and Pakistans and India and the people. So it was more about grabbing as much land as possible in one of the states. Now, what about the princely states? I think princely states, there are about 600. Some of them, uh, they were neither homogeneous nor they're uniform. Some of the biggest states like Hyderabad and Kashmir, and smallest them were one of in Kathiawar, which is less than 1 acre broad and a population of 186 only in 1921. Many of them were bigger than some European nations. Kashmir, with an area of 84,000 square miles, was bigger than France. Travancore had a population of over 5 million, which is more than Portugal and Australia. And the income and expenditure Hyderabad state was more than many members of the United States of the time. Very interesting, the revenue earning in one of the state of Jaora was rupees 12 only, and annual income was very interesting complexities. India Act 1935 had designated some areas of tribal areas of Northeast India as excluded and partially excluded area, basically meaning they are excluded from political reforms. But this designation was taken by the people as a right to withdraw from India after independence. So the basis of citizenship in India after independence. Now, the June 3 declaration of the British withdrawal from India led to the lapse of British paramountcy over the states. Is virtually reverted the states to their pre-British independent status. By standstill agreement, status quo was maintained until the future status was determined. Government of India set up States Department under Home Ministry to ensure the integration of states in India. State could merge with either dominion by signing the instrument of accession, and government used sometimes mass pressure, popular movement, sometimes bait and sometimes coercion to secure the merge. First, I discuss Kashmir because without Kashmir, because my is to discuss in the name of integration, because as I said in the title, the partition and integration don't really go together, but sometimes integration led to partition of certain areas and certain partition led to the integration of certain areas as a result of this very complicated process. Now, Kashmir was the frontier region gateway to Central Asia, is a composite state of Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, is a Hindu king, Muslim subject, and Pakistan claiming the right over Kashmir because it has a majority of Muslim population. And the news of communal riot aggravated the rebellion that took place in Poonch and Manipur region in northern Kashmir. The rebel forces were organized under a Muslim conference leader named Sardar Ibrahim and overran most of western Kashmir in their bid from independence from Kashmir. On 22nd October, the seizure was complete and the formal declaration of the formation of Azad Kashmir Provisional Government was government. I see this as the first partition of Kashmir. Secondly, by September 1947, Pakistan sponsored an armed invasion of Kashmir by the Pashtun tribes. There was an effective economic blockade of Kashmir. A desperate Kashmiri king appealed to India, which refused to on the ground that it could not intervene in a foreign land from foreign land, and therefore the king was compelled to sign the instrument of accession. The invaders were pushed back and the ceasefire ended war in January 1949, but one-third of Kashmir remained under Pakistan as Pak-occupied Kashmir, while southern Kashmir was integrated in India. This was the second partition of Kashmir. Then in northern India, the Gilgit agency in northern Kashmir was virtually autonomous, even under the Dogra king, tormented by stories of communal riots and resenting accession to Kashmir. To India, the Gilgit Scout troops, a body of locally recruited paramilitary troops created by the British, attempted to coup and declared independence only to be eventually acceding to partition. This was the third partition of Kashmir. Kashmir has experienced multiple partition while the integration was still, its integration with India was still contested by Pakistan. There is a map given in the, this I've taken from Google because most governments have their maps, which is very, very contested. You can see the which part of India belong to India, Pakistan, and Kashmir. The last was by taking advantage of the uh, undefined boundary. In 1962, Chinese took much to occupy the territory known as Aksai. Part of this territory was already under occupation of China, but China now added to Trans-Karakoram range, demarcated as the line of control between China and Pakistan. The territory claimed by India as part of Kashmir was contested to result in the line of actual control. India is able to retain Siachen Glacier from China. The integration of Kashmir actually led to the multiple partition of its territory. In effect, India has approximately 55% of Kashmiri territory, which included Jammu, Kashmir, Ladakh, and Siachen Glacier, which are having 70% of its population, approximately 30% of Kashmiri land, which includes areas like Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, is under Pakistani control, where the residual 50% that included Aksai Chin and Trans-Karakoram tract, as well as part of the Demchok sector are controlled by China, although maps of the respective countries show different. This is a quite well-known Kashmir story, so I'm not going into the detail. I come into Tripura. Tripura, you will say in the next map, the Tripura comprises two areas. One is hill Tripura, and one is plain area. Plain areas where the part in Kumilla and Noakhali districts of Bengal, which were actually the king of Tripura was the zamindars, designated zamindars of the area. And these are the revenue areas, because seeds did not produce means most of the revenue came from these plain areas, which are known as chaklas. So it was generally known Chakla Roshanabad area of Tripura. Now, when Tripura was right from the beginning inclined to join India, but because it was in the border of East Pakistan, the Muslim League volunteers started operating in Pakistan and generating a movement for merger with Pakistan. The desperate Queen appealed to Patel, the Home Minister. Patel moved the army as well as instructed the governor of Assam to get the integration effected. And when it was, Tripura became part of India, but minus the plain areas of Tripura. The plain with the Chakla Rashanabad area or the plain revenue areas of Tripura remain with East Bengal, and only the hill areas merge with India, which basically meaning that the present Tripura that we have now, it is only the hill Tripura. After integration, the Red Cliff Commission gave away all these areas to Eastern Bengal. So integration again in the case of Tripura led to actually virtual partitioning of territory, though it was neither Muslim area or Hindu area. It was not even, Tripura was not even in the Lahore reservation. So I have given in the next map, if you can go over, is that this is, you can see the hill Tripura, the green portion, and the red portion is the plain areas. The entire red portion plain area has gone to Eastern Bengal, and only hill Tripura remains. Now I may come to the another sets of states in Northeast India, which is known as Khasi Jaintia state. Both are prince states, but Jaintia state was never given the status of a prince state. It remained a formal part of the British Empire. There are 25 Khasi states which formed the federation and functioned as such during the British rule. But when India became independent, the governor summoned these the CMs or the rulers of these 25 states to come and join the instrument of accession. Most of the states joined, but like Tripura, Khasi and Jaintia states were the hill, but their revenue lands were in the plain areas of Sylhet. Now, some of the states like Chera and Noboshopo and Nongspon, they did not want to join because then their land remained Pakistan. So they refused to merge with India because without their land, with their mine, mostly petroleum and iron and lime, these mines will remain in Pakistan. But eventually, under the pressure, most of the states signed the agreement. Two chiefs refused to sign the agreement. The CM of Chera feared the impending partition will take away all his cultivable land and land quarries to Pakistan. The states of Nobisoko and Nongstong signed the instrument only on 11 January 1940, followed by Mao. There remain chiefs of Rambrai and Nongsen who delayed the signing, and Akbar Haidari, the governor of Assam, told Rambrai, let Junagar not be repeated in Khasi Hills. Therefore, Rambai had to accede under coercion on 17 March. Wycliffe, the CM is actually the local name of the ruler, who was likely successor of the state, refused to stay in India because most of his land and quarries were in Pakistan. So he migrated to Pakistan and stayed there. And from there, he appealed to United Nations for, recovering his land, which of course did not happen. But though the princely states of Khasi and Jaintia remained in India, the Khasi, Jaintia, Garo, Hajung, and Chakma tribes were divided between India and Pakistan, though they were neither Hindus nor Muslims. They were tribals professing their own religion. The Khasi lands that were in the plains of Sylhet were transferred to Pakistan. Similarly, the huts, the markets, which was the backbone of the Khasi economy in the Chera, Shena, Balat, and Ratachara frontier, were transferred to Pakistan, crippling Khasi economy. The Khasi habitat in Pirtua had gone to Pakistan, which was recovered by the Indian Army during the Bangladesh War, but subsequently, the Bangladesh Army invaded Pirtua in 2001 and took over the land from India. In fact, Jaintia's tribe had lost even their capital, which is known as Jaintia, to Sylhet in Pakistan. Along with this, gone most of the plains land which were owned by the Jaintias. It was the plains land which produced most of the food requirement of the Jaintia. There were also revenue lands. There were stretches from Dauki to Muktapur in Jaintia Hills, having large tracts belonging to the Khasi, which was affected by partition, crossing Hawaii Tilla and river Warling, so miles of fertile land no longer belong to the Khasis. And these lands still continue to be contested. And I have given a map which you can see that this side, the southern side, is all Bengal, and most of the land, both Khasis and the plains lands have remained in Pakistan, though the native states of Khasi Hills and Jaintia Hills were integrated. Now I come to the state of Coach Bihar. Coach Bihar was a princely state in eastern India, known, but right from the beginning, its ruler was inclined to merge with India. But there were forces like the Hitashadri Sabha, which wanted to merge with East Pakistan, but the state Prajamandal wanted to merge with Indian Union. The Rajbanshi, the natives of the Coach Bihar, however, who belong to the scheduled caste community, but claimed certificate said that they wanted to have a land called Rajasthan, and means the land of the Rajas, Kshatriyas, as an independent state. While the Rajbanshi designated for Rajasthan, some members of the hill tribes in the local Hitashadini Sabha looked to Sikkim, Nepal, and Bhutan for the formation of Uttarakhand Pradesh. This is not the Uttarakhand that we know about. They wanted to form another Uttarakhand, taking Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Coach Bihar together, an independent state. But when this report of these armies had reached Patel had introduced the Sri Prakasha, and the merger treaty of Coach Bihar was signed in August 1941. What is important is the Coach Bihar, like most princely states, had a lot of land which were called chakla. And chakla basically means, like Tripura means revenue land. These chaklas were small cluster of villages which were in the plains, which were in Rangpur district. Though Coach Bihar was an independent state, surrounding it was West Dinajpur district, Rangpur district of Bengal. Now these chaklas were within these areas. Now when Coach Bihar was integrated, these chaklas, or Chit Mahals as they are known, later on they were known as advanced division, they remained in Bengal. And therefore, when Bengal became East Pakistan, these land also remained in East Pakistan. It virtually meant that Coach Bihar was integrated minus the Chit Mahals, which was its own revenue land. And therefore, even till 2019, this remained a problem. This remained a problem in adverse position. There were 161 such adverse position of these 111 enclaves are Union territories that were under the control of Bangladesh. Again, there were 51 Bangladesh enclaves which were under Indian control. These enclaves were actually these chitmahals, which are originally, you can see some dotted lines in this map. These are the chitmahal areas. These are very, very small areas, cluster of villages, sometimes even two villages. And therefore, they were too far to be controlled by Indians. So they remained there until 2019. They were under under the adverse position of Bangladesh, and similarly the adverse position of India. And these are actually the belongings of Kuch Bihar. So the integration of Kuch Bihar actually meant the partition between Kuch Bihar and its Chitmahal area. Now I come to another princely state, which is called Manipur, one of the native states. And Manipur reverted to its independence status in 15 August after India became independent. There was pressure from the government of India to the Maharaja to sign the instrument of accession, which he refused, saying the legislator had the right to do it, and he did not have the room. But during his result in Shillong, Governor of Assam exerted pressure on him and which to sign, which he did after negotiation, after the promising of a fat private purse. In 1949, therefore, Manipur became a part of the Union of India. But the people of Manipur were enraged because the king was not empowered, entitled to sign the instrument accession. It was the people, and therefore said that it was the government of India had cheated the people of Manipur by getting the accession done. But one portion, Manipur had a very integral part of it called the Kabau Valley, which is between Manipur and Burma. So occasionally Burma seized this portion from Manipur, and Manipur got it back. So after independence, it came back because Burma was separated in 1948, and therefore this portion came back to Manipur. But for some strange unknown reason, suddenly it was found that Kabau Valley had gone back to Burma. No one knows how it went back to Burma. There is this allegation by the people of Manipur that it was gifted away by the Prime Minister of India to Burma as a goodwill gesture. But the reason this partitioning of Burma and gifting of Manipuri land to Burma. Now I come to the last one, that is the curious case of Sylhet. Now Sylhet is not a princely state. It is was in Bengal, nor is in Pakistan, which is supposed to be partition. It was a district of Assam, but Muslim League demanded it because it had a majority of Muslim population. So the government of India announced that there will be a referendum. According to referendum, Sylhet was transferred to Pakistan, but the mandate of the Boundary Commission, the Commission, was that no district should be partitioned. If the district has to be given to the other side, it has to be given in full. But Sylhet was, despite the mandate, Sylhet was not fully given. About Hindu majority areas of Ratabadi, Patharkhandi, and Badarpur, and Thanas of the old Karimganj subdivision of Sylhet were retained in Assam, evidently or allegedly to provide geographical continuity and road connection between the princely states of Tripura and India, because otherwise there was no access to Tripura. So despite the transfer of the district to Sylhet, the district was partitioned, and one part of it is retained in India, which is now part of the Kachar district, the Karimganj district of Assam, and this was taken to provide the connection, geographical continuity to the princess. I'll just conclude with three important quotations from some very important personalities. In the words of architect of Indian integration, that is V.P. Menon, I quote, "By partition, India had lost an area of 3,64,737 square miles and a population of 81.5 million. By integration of states in area of 5 lakh square miles with a population of 86.5 million, not including the Jammu and Kashmir, was added." So these mathematics, we need to understand this mathematics, how by partition, how much land and people we lost, and how much we gained by introduction. V.P. Menon, when there was a criticism of using bait and coercion, V.P. Menon replied, No policy of a democratic government, however beneficial, can be fully immune from criticism. The integration of Indian state was no exception. There were some who accused the state ministry of having tempted the rulers into new order. There were others who were opposed to the integration of the so-called viable states, and not a few regretted the loss of the ruler's personal touch. But if we were to establish stability and ordered government in the country, we had to act quickly while the situation still in a fluid state. I end with a quote by Nehru. I think it's a very, very remarkable and profound statement on the process of integration of India. He says, the historian who looks back will no doubt consider the integration of the states into India as one of the most dominant phase of Indian history. Thank you. I think I finished in time.
Thank you, Professor Nag, for that very insightful and very informative presentation about the different princely states in Northeast India and how they were integrated and the challenges faced. This is a story which many people are not aware of. And of course, the Sylhet story is well known, but the other states that you mentioned. And of course, this raises the question of communities which continue to be cross-border, who look at national borders in a different way because they look at the resources, the families which are divided. So the whole notion of territory and border is rather different in their perception. We have a slight change in the program, and this is for everyone in the audience. I would request you to provide questions for Professor Sajal Nag's presentation, because he very kindly has joined us in spite of being somewhat indisposed, and we would like him to take the questions, and then perhaps he might take our leave. So for that, due to that consideration, if there are questions for him, we would like to take up those questions at this moment. So these could be sent by the chat box to our organizer, Winnie. Meanwhile, if I could request the other two panelists if they have any questions for Professor Nag or any comments. Would I perhaps, ask for some details? So in some ways, you said that the large part of Tripura went to East Pakistan, and the plains went to East Bengal, and then the hills remained with India. And the Khasi Jantia state also had to integrate with. The disruption came with the Sylhet, the whole question of Sylhet, and the very controversial referendum. So by the late 50s, by the first elections take place in 52, the second elections take place in 56, 57. Are things settled by that time, or are people getting used to the idea of being citizens of a democratic country where there is no monarchical order? There's a direct relationship between the state and individuals in terms of citizenship. Is that happening?
Well, by and large, it is happening. By and large, people are settled with the fact, but somehow they could not reconcile with the loss of land and kinsmen. Generally, we talk about Bengalis and Punjabis, being partitioned. Very few people know that large number of Khasis are in Bangladesh, and large number of Jaintias are in Bangladesh, and they are not unhappy there. But in India, people are still trying to get accustomed to the idea that land is no more. The plains, because as I said, the hills cannot survive without plains anywhere. Sure. Hills can be the abode and habitat for people, but their markets, their revenue land, their agriculture, everything is in the plains, especially if it is available. And Khasi land, it's just not the land. Khasis survive basically, both Khasis and Jaintias, on their quarries, lime quarries, most important.
Mm.
And there are some very important books published by Bangladeshi scholars showing that the blind queries remain in Bangladesh, but the factories in India and how they are trying to negotiate. So uh, they're trying to reconcile with these laws, and that is why they resist the attempt to form the fences. There is even now there is agitation. They don't want the fences to be to be
Right.
erected, because once the access that they had, even though it is partition, still now it is kind of open. They can go to the other side, do their shopping, come back under the eyes of the thing. But
Sure.
that sense is there, and it will take some time. And there is now and then often that the instrument they wanted to take the instrument action, some leaders, some instrument of action, signing of instrument action to the court, and
Sure.
and
Sure.
go to the Supreme Court and see whether it was right to
Yes.
get the instrument accession thing. So that kind
Yes.
of forces are there, but by large, people have generally they accepted the idea of partition and loss of land and people.
Right. So is it true that some Khasi hill states applied to join Pakistan, but their papers were
Yes, I
misplaced or
mentioned
lost?
two states I mentioned, because not only that, their rulers themselves have migrated to this that Pakistan, and actually one of them died in Pakistan 2 years back,
Mm.
and from there they repeatedly wrote to the United Nations that this was the case. Their land remained in Pakistan, and most of their people are in India, and they want to remain independent, uh,
Okay.
because that is possible. But these are very feeble voices.
The recent settlement around the enclaves, the Chars, has that taken care of these
Yeah,
small?
most
They have
of
been
the areas of Khasis and the hills have come back to India, thankfully,
okay.
including the one that I mentioned, Pirdua, over which there was a war between Bangladesh and India in 2001. That land has been given to India, and Khasis have received it. Uh, right now, there is no adverse possession area of the Khasis which are under the
Right.
control of Bangladesh. So they have got most. So it is more or less settled after
Right.
the last.
So
by-
perhaps
yeah.
another comment, you could respond to this. So this comment is that Sark has never been an integrating platform like SCO and NAFTA. So how can Sark be functional and result-oriented in cementing the states in South Asia, particularly in the northeastern context? Would you like to respond to this?
Sark, I think in settling adverse position areas, Sark has been instrumental, and the entire bilateral agreement and all that was a result of discussion, because on the sideways of Sark meeting, these issues were discussed right from Pakistan's time, and then Indira Modi and everything. But beyond that, I do not know whether Sark is still a functional organization.
Yes,
So,
of course.
so, but it did play a role once a time. But I don't think there is any more that it can do.
Sure. Is the recent look east policy of India in terms of opening up, the border links, strengthening those between the Northeast and Southeast Asia, have these been working in your view, with the vantage point that you have sitting in Silchar?
Yeah, it does and it doesn't, because if you go and see the markets that work as a part of Act's policies, these are small, very, very small market, not the one that we kind of visualize it, but the huge international markets in both. These are small, about maybe 10 from that side and 20 from that side, come with small tokeries of food, fruits
I
available.
see.
So
I
this
see.
doesn't really solve really this kind of
Yes.
the kind of international market we have in our vision. These
Yes.
are even not 1% of those.
Yes.
These are very, very small village markets organized in the border. People come and exchange,
Right.
and that's what. So I don't think it is going more
More
much
than
beyond.
that. Okay.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah.
That's very, very interesting.
Mm.
So I think it's probably time for us to thank there, since there are no other specific questions for Professor Sajal, it's time for us to thank him for that wonderful presentation. We learned a lot. And this is, one of the commentators who perhaps knows a lot about the Northeast is said that this is the first time I'm seeing the history of accession of Northeastern princely states to the Union of India. So this is so interesting. And why is it that, this has been a neglected area somewhat? So we end with that comment, and we thank you for that wonderful presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm sorry I won't be able to speak. I'm not well, as I said. I'll
there
get the
will be.
later.
I'm sure there'll be future opportunities for you to engage with ISIS. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we turn to Dr. Yaqub Khan Bangash. May I? Yes, and he is going to be talking about centralizing the Federation, princely states, and the consolidation of Pakistan between 1948 and 1955. So over to you, Dr. Bangash.
Thank you very much, and I'm so happy to be at the ISIS, even though virtually. But it's very good to be here, and it's wonderful to hear about the Northeast. As one of the commentators said very rightly, that the Northeast has actually been very much ignored in the history of the integration of the princely states, and these are very important considerations that haven't been assessed. And people always wonder why places like Manipur and Nagaland and all of that were up in insurgency, but this is really very much related to them having princely lineage. Let me just share my screen at the moment. So I'm going to talk about the integration of the princely states in terms of Pakistan, and I'm going to make sort of a couple of broad kind of arguments there, which have been mentioned earlier on in my research, but some actually I've sort of again ended up revisiting the question of the princely states in recent years, and I've actually found more interesting things, especially in relating to Pakistan. Now, considering that the Indian case was just spoken about, I was going to give a preface to that, but I'll skip that to a certain extent during my comments. One thing which I should say is that even though, of course, we are talking about the past, but now with like 75 years having elapsed since the independence of both India and Pakistan, one very important thing, especially in relation to Pakistan, is that a lot of its issues, a lot of its consolidation issues are still related to the uneven consolidation of the princely states that happened in the period immediately following 1947 and their accession to Pakistan. So it's not always, so it's just not the case that we are kind of recounting the past. We're actually talking about very much issues that relate to the present. And of course, the most important legacy of the princely states that continues in Pakistan is the to an extent, a never-ending insurgency in the province of Balochistan that used to be the princely state of Kalar. So yes, these are considerations of the past, but they have very important and continuing influences on what has happened and is happening in Pakistan. Now, as you all know, this was the map of the British Indian Empire. As you can see, all the yellow bits are princely states and all the red bits are British India. And I show this over and over again, even to scholars of British India, because they kind of forget that the princely states were about 1/3 of India. It was a very, very large landmass. And they just take for granted that when the maps of Pakistan and India are shown on the 15th of August, 1947, they just assume all the princely states to be a part of either country, whereas that wasn't the case for a large number of princely states. They hadn't acceded even on the 15th of August. Some had, but some hadn't. And this is something that gives that, nationalist historiography, both in India and Pakistan, has actually deliberately, I think, developed these maps so that people actually forget that there were these princely states, that there were these competing jurisdictions. And people also forget that even though the nation states of India and Pakistan, were born on the 15th of August, 1947, a lot of these princely states hail back to 1,000 years. Like if you go to the south of India, places like Travancore, or if you go to the Rajputana states, Udaipur, Jaipur, Jaisalmer, all these states, harken back nearly 1,000 years at times. So these were very long and deep state formations that the new nation state of India and also Pakistan, of course, tried to really just erase out of history. And this was a very brutal sort of thing, not just politically, but also socially, culturally, and in many ways that we are still kind of reeling the ramifications of it. Now, I should kind of show you the very badly drawn map that I have used because I don't know too much about sort of online things. But this is the map of West Pakistan on the 15th of August 1947, and I show this importantly because again, when Pakistan was formed, it was only formed of British Indian territories and not the princely states, because by the 15th of August, not even one princely state had actually acceded to Pakistan, and therefore showing a map of what Pakistan ended up being on the 15th of August is just wrong. And the reason I also show this map is to bring to the fore the fact that if the princely states had not joined Pakistan, and if they had, let's say, joined India or had stayed independent, or in some cases joined Afghanistan or Iran, Pakistan's trajectory would have been very different. So if you look at the south, a large part of what is now the Balochistan province was the state of Kalat. And that had a very long contiguous boundary with Iran. So it could very well join Iran. And then Pakistan would not have had this long Balochistan coast. Then if you look at the east, both Khairpur and Bahawalpur, two very important princely states, they had a contiguous boundary with India. So they could have, hypothetically joined India. And then again, Pakistan would have looked very odd. And in fact, if either of them had joined India, the rail link between Karachi and Lahore would have been broken because the rail link actually went through both of these states. And then if you look towards the north, the princely states on the frontier, they could have joined Afghanistan or even China for that matter, because if the states had linked up, they would have had a contiguous boundary with China. So the reality that all these princely states kind of joined Pakistan is something that we take for granted. But on the 15th of August, as Pakistan was created, these were not a given, and it took literally a year of negotiation, cajoling, even threats in the case of Kalat, for them to actually join Pakistan. And it was a long process, and it was very much sort of done at different levels. So whereas a standard instrument of accession, as was mentioned earlier, that was signed by most princely states, you had the state of Dir, where the Nawab refused to sign anything, and in fact said that I will only sign a statement saying that my relations with the government of Pakistan are exactly the same as they were with the government of British India and the crown. And that's the only thing he ever signed. So he never signed an instrument of accession. So even at the time of accession, Pakistan had this varied degree of varying levels of accession for the princely states. Now, I'll move very fast forward because, of course, we are not talking about the accession of the states, but about the integration, where I'll make three broad points. So nearly a one-year process. And by the end of that one-year process, this is the map of Pakistan. Now is what we now consider Pakistan. And if you see, Kalat, that's another story which I can't go into, that Kalat was actually broken up into four states, which you can now see in the Balochistan area. You see Khairpur and Bahawalpur joining Pakistan, and you see Dir, Swat, Chitral, and lots of the tribal areas. And then in the north, Hunza and Nagar, which of course give Pakistan a contiguous boundary even now with China. And of course, one state is missing here, which did join Pakistan and actually was the first one, but then was occupied and annexed by India, which was the state of Junagar, which was on the Kathiawar coast, but then was occupied by India. Now, the pattern of integration, my main argument here is, of the princely states in Pakistan was markedly different from India. And my argument is that different pattern of integration exhibited a number of very important themes that relate to state building in Pakistan, and in fact created a kind of a mold, created a kind of a mechanism in which Pakistan operated, not just in the princely states, but in the rest of Pakistan. So when we look at the integration of the princely states, the way that happened also informs us about how Pakistan developed itself as a political entity and has a great impact on the understanding of governance in Pakistan. So the princely states form an integral part of this understanding. And lest we also forget that if you look at West Pakistan, princely states form more than 50% of the territory of West Pakistan. So this is not just a very small number of states that you're talking about. Not only that the number is large, but territorially they form a very large landmass, and in fact are strategically located on the boundaries with every neighbor of Pakistan. And in fact, again, if Hunza and Nagar had not joined Pakistan would not have had a boundary with China. So the whole thing that we're talking about CPEC now and all the connections that Pakistan has with China, those would not have realized if these princely states had not joined Pakistan. Now, just a quick kind of a mention, and then I'll move on. If you look at the picture here, this is just after the integration of the Indian princely states, and what you can see in sort of the yellow bits are princely states, and then some of the sort of the bluish bits are all, well, some of them are princely states. But what I wanted to show, if you look at the first map that I showed you of the British Indian Empire, is that in India, two very important policies were actually made. One was that princely states, unless they were very large, like Hyderabad or Mysore, were actually grouped into regional alliances. So all the Rajput states came together as Rajputana, and all the Punjab states came together as Patiala and East Punjab States Union. And these states these states also had to democratize. So very quickly they were kind of sort of subsumed into the national character of India. And in 1951 there were elections in India, and they became very much a part of India. Now, what happened in Pakistan, and I know very quickly running out of time, so I shall be very quick with that. So three very important things. The Raj resurrected. That's one of the main arguments that I'm making, which is that the main focus of the government of Pakistan in the accession of the princely states was to consolidate power in the central government of Pakistan and take it away from the prince. And if you look at all the supplementary instruments of accession that the government of Pakistan signs with all these princely states, the focus is not to democratize the process. The focus is not to integrate them more into Pakistan. In fact, the focus is to keep them separate as entities, but to ensure that more and more power is transferred from the ruler, not to a democratically elected assembly, but to the government of Pakistan. The first thing that they actually do, and I'll just quickly read through it, was the first instrument of accession of Bhalpur state in October 1948, where they agreed to integrate their armed forces with Pakistan. And then the Bhalpur government also agreed that the Prime Minister of Bhavalpur will also act as an agent of the Pakistan government. So the first thing was to ensure that the day-to-day governance, which is done by the Prime Minister, is taken over by the government of Pakistan. In Khairpur state by 1949, the argument was that the Chief Minister, the head of the executive government, would actually be appointed by the government of Pakistan, and in fact, therefore, will be an agent of the government of Pakistan, and will hold most of the executive authority. So very quickly, the government of Pakistan began to take over control. Then the government of Bahawalpur Interim Constitution Act of March 1952 came up, and that democratized Bahawalpur to a certain extent, that they had elections and they had an elected chief minister, but it gave the Amir, the ruler of Bahawalpur, a lot of reserve powers, a lot of concentration of powers, where he could dismiss the assembly, he could promulgate laws by himself, and in fact, most of the important things that were being decided, like law and order, finance, all of them were the purview of the Amir, and the Amir could override the elected assembly in that case. And what's really fascinating is that what also the government did was appointed an advisor, a centrally government appointed advisor to the Amir of Bahawalpur that advised him on everything. And the Bahawalpur Amir also agreed through a supplementary instrument of accession that he will not disagree with the advice of his advisor, and if he does, he will appeal to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and accept his judgment as final. So very quickly, the focus was to take power in the hands of the central government and consolidate it there. Now, I've got examples from the other princely states and how it happened there, but I'll skip over that just in the interest of time. The second argument that I really quickly want to talk about is, was democracy brought in there? The short answer is, of course, yes, to a limited extent, but not to a great extent. And here I give the example of the All Pakistan States Muslim League, which was equivalent to the All India States People's Conference, which was the equivalent of the International Congress in the princely states. And what's very interesting is that as soon as the princely states accede to Pakistan, the All Pakistan States Muslim League begins to clamor for responsible government in the princely states. And the reaction, and that I think is really, really fascinating, the reaction of the government of Pakistan is not to support the democratization, but the decision of the government is to thwart the democratization and in fact to control and in fact even disband the state's Muslim League. And this is a very interesting statement for the government, from the governor of the NWFP to the Prime Minister, saying that, you know, the activities of the state's Muslim League should be postponed for, if not a few years, a few months. And the Pakistan Prime Minister then also responds and says that, yes, there is no reason to have a separate state's Muslim League, and we need to do away with that. So what they, by the end of it, do, they disband the state's Muslim League so that the only form of political organization that remains in the states is a centrally appointed Muslim League, very much controlled by the center. And this kind of makes it into a farce that even though Khairpur in November 1950 becomes the first place in Pakistan where an assembly is elected on the basis of adult franchise, and the Prime Minister of Pakistan goes there, inaugurates it, and congratulates it. The farce is that it cannot even elect its chief minister. It is still appointed by the government of Pakistan. And that most of the main issues like finance and law and order and revenue are not within its purview. So a lot of the democratic kind of changes are not really are cosmetic in the princely states. Now, the last point that I really want to make, and I'll just take another minute to finish this, that was there a transition in this 5 or 6 year period that a lot of the princely states were pretty independent in Pakistan. The main thing that happened was that the power of the rulers was contained, but the power was not transferred to the people through democratic means, but to the central government. Yes, there were changes made in education, healthcare, law and justice, and communications, and a lot of development happened, but it was a top-down approach and dependent really on the central civilian governments. But yet, I should say, a concept of a welfare state had begun to develop, and people were expecting things, as this long quote from the Khairpur chief minister relates to, that people were expecting things, and people were expecting that they would convert from subjects to citizens. Now, the one unit in October 1955 abolished most of the princely states except the frontier ones and Hunza and Nagar. And here I just want to, like, one quote that I really do want to kind of point out is that the Khairpur Assembly actually opposes all of this merger and says that as a small unit, Khairpur has done really well, where its income has increased by 310% as compared to 665 in East Bengal and 41 in the Punjab. And in fact, that its expenditure on the people is also higher than the rest of Pakistan. And this therefore gave a very interesting example of a small unit in Pakistan. And here's a longer resolution that the Khairpur Assembly passes against joining this one unit. But here's a very important example where a small unit was actually doing really well. So when we dismiss the princely states as is vestiges of the past and autocracies and not developed places, a lot of them were actually making strides and actually were doing really good by the time they were removed. So the conclusion: the uneven integration pattern of the princely states in Pakistan created grievances which still continue. I've already mentioned the Balochistan insurgency that continues, but there's also resentment in southern Punjab, and that resentment very much centers on the Bahawalpur princely state, and they really want a separate province there. In the same way, on the frontier, also a lot of the resentment and in fact a lot of the Talibanization was related to these states being princely states in the past and harking back to a time when things were really better. And therefore, the Taliban really got a foothold there. The second important thing here to remember is the ascendancy of the military and bureaucracy. So way before 1953, when the Governor General Ghulam Muhammad dismisses the prime minister and takes over power, you have the military and the bureaucracy taking control of the princely states. And if you remember the boundaries of West Pakistan, that means that they have control of the boundaries and most of the landmass of Pakistan, even before 1953. So even before what was formerly British India comes under the influence of the bureaucrats and the military, they've consolidated their power in the princely states. And in fact, I argue it's this consolidation that then moves forward to help them control the rest of Pakistan. And the last bit is that the integration of all the princely states and the provinces into one unit created the resentment from smaller units, which to a large extent continues up till now. So sorry about taking so long, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been a very, very interesting, very insightful presentation, telling us about how the geo-body of Pakistan came to be established under such trying and challenging circumstances, and how central was the project of integration of princely states, which is often not realized in mainstream history writing. So we will have questions, I'm sure. There would be questions and comments for you, Dr. Mangash, and we'll take them up later on. So may I invite Dr. Hemanti Roy to proceed. We are running somewhat late, so over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kudesia. And I'll try to keep time, but let's see. So I just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Amit Ranjan, Vinny, and Iqbal for inviting me to this conference. Dr. Kudesia, along with Dr. Tantai Yong, were one of the first historians whose work I read on the aftermath of the partition. And I want to take a moment to thank them for opening up new areas of inquiry. So today I'm going to pivot away from the earlier panelists in that I'm going to be looking at citizenship and experiences of people with it after 1947 in India. And I'm kind of going to start with 3 stories. So I'll be brief, given the time restrictions. So the first story is about Qamar Jamali, who in 1954 filed a civil suit in Bhopal High Court against his deportation from India to Pakistan on the grounds that he was an Indian citizen. In his petition to the court, he lists the basis of his citizenship. He was born in Bhopal in 1922, had worked there until his arrest in 1952, and his name was on the voters list of Bhopal Legislative Assembly. Most importantly, he had never gone to Pakistan, even temporarily. So why was Jamali identified as a Pakistani and was being deported there? The second story is from August 1987, and it focuses on the scion of Bombay dyeing, Nasli Wadia, who at the time was a British citizen with a British passport, who made the claim that he was actually Indian when he registered at a Delhi hotel. This started off a long litigious process with the Indian government, who claimed that Wadia, who, as you may know, was a grandson of Jinnah, had misrepresented him as Indian when he was actually a British citizen. Wadia filed a writ petition against the state action, claiming that he was born in India and had resided there for a number of years. Additionally, he had been an Indian passport holder between 1952 to 1962. Taking a British passport for travel purposes did not disqualify him from being an Indian citizen, according to him. So why did India not consider Wadia to be Indian citizen, given that he lived mostly in India, thereby fulfilling domicile requirements and held property there? The third story happened almost a few days back. In the last week, the BBC reported that a woman had been rendered stateless in 3 countries, United Kingdom, Uganda, and India. Ila Popat, who had been living in India for the last 5 decades, was refused a passport, and her request to register herself as an Indian citizen was denied. Popat was born in Uganda in 1955. Uganda at this time was still part of the British Empire. Then she came to India on her mother's passport when she was 10. Her parents' passports, like many Indians in Eastern Africa, was one which identified them as British protected persons. However, this was not enough for her to apply for a British passport in later years. She could not get an Ugandan passport because she did not fulfill the domicile or lineage requirements. So how did Popat become stateless after 5 decades of making a life in India? These 3 stories are part of 3 distinct yet interrelated histories of citizenship. These emerge in the post-colonial moment in the decades of the 1950s and 60s when Indian citizenship had to consider both territoriality, location, and mobility of its people across new nation states and overseas. The mobility of certain groups, minority Muslims, married women, Indians emigrating to in the post-colonial decades, and overseas Indians were critical in how the framers of the post-colonial decade thought about Indian citizenship. The Citizenship Act of 1955, like the Constitution of 1950, made provisions for refugees coming in from Pakistan be the minority Hindu community who were most likely to migrate to India and assume refugee status, and thereafter demand inclusion as citizens. Although the rules of citizenship did not particularly favor one group of Pakistani migrants over another, official policy acknowledged repeatedly that minority Hindus from Pakistan would get preference since they were most likely to want to become Indian citizens. Underlying such assumptions was the continuing effect of the communal logic of the partition. The scholarship on the status of partitions displaced is well formed. Much has been said and written about citizenship of refugees and migrants from and to India and Pakistan after 1947. Scholars, including myself, have noted that how the partition and its aftermath brought into central focus the questions of identity, nationality, and of belonging for those who moved across the newly created borders. Others have noted that while territoriality was central to the understandings of post-colonial citizenship, citizenship of refugees and migrants in the 1950s and by the 1980s began to be framed around laws of descent. The amendments of the Citizenship Act of 1955, which were added in 2004 and then again in 2019, further confirmed the shift away from a territorial framing of citizenship towards a citizenship based on descent. I want to add another strand, that of the citizenship of Indians overseas, to this now familiar narrative. While partition created ambiguities around belonging, when it came to those living outside the territories of India, leaders mistakenly thought that it would be a quote unquote simple matter of resolving their status. As those living outside India, these groups would not be Indians. For example, Nehru noted early on, and I quote, "We have millions of people in foreign parts and other countries. Some of those may be taken to be foreign nationals, although they are Indians in origin. Others still consider themselves to some extent as Indians, and yet they have also got some kind of local nationality too, like for instance in Malaya, Singapore, Fiji, and Mauritius. If you deprive them of their local nationality, they become aliens there," end quote. Accordingly, Indian consulates and high commissions in Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean were instructed to urge local Indian populations to either register themselves as Indians within a short deadline or claim citizenship in the country they resided in. Most importantly, the diaspora had to provide documentary proof of belonging and they could not assume that their Indian citizenship was automatic. For the framers, one of the concerns was whether Indians who had lived in overseas territories for generations would now be seen by authorities of those territories as having divided loyalties. For H.N. Kunzru, the issue was clear, and I quote, "Obviously, we cannot allow a man whose ancestors settled down in another country 200 years ago to be still regarded as an Indian citizen. There must be some limit to the time during which the descendants of people who are Indians should be regarded as Indians, even though they are living outside of India," end quote. Similarly, B.R. Ambedkar clarified that for those residing abroad whose grandparents and parents were born in India, Article 5B should be regarded as Indians abroad and would need to make an application to their consular representatives if they wanted to be citizens of India before the commencement of the Constitution. and he noted that these are very simple matters. Such matters were hardly simple, as the draft constitution's definition of an Indian citizen raised particular concerns regarding the fate of Indians in places such as Burma, Ceylon, and Malaya. In particular, the discussions revolved around those Indians who hail from areas now part of Pakistan, but did not intend to return there and considered themselves to be Indians. Were those in Pakistan to be on the same footing as those Indians who lived overseas? B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor, found this connection unacceptable and argued that, and I quote, "The main difficulty is that these persons, who lived overseas, have at present no territorial connection of any kind with India, that is to say, with post-partition India. They were not born in India, nor were any of their parents or grandparents born in India, nor it would seem are they in a position even to visit India for a month and declare that they intend to make India their permanent abode." End quote. In Rao's understanding, such a procedure in principle would allow Muslims in India to declare themselves as Pakistanis without having to move to Pakistan. He argued that if India could confer citizenship on persons who by birth and descent belong to Pakistan, then many Muslims in India could become Pakistani citizens simply by registering with the Pakistan High Commission in India and taking an oath of allegiance to Pakistan. Nehru clarified this issue by clearly noting that there was to be a distinction in procedures for citizenship of Indians overseas and those living within the territories of India and Pakistan. Pakistan was thus not in the same ranking as other foreign countries, and those who belonged there, in Rao's or Nehru's mind, could not become Indians. The debates generated on the eve of the passage of Citizenship Bill 1955 captured some other concerns regarding loyalty and attempts to craft a jus soli notion of Indian citizenship. S. Mohanty, a Rajya Sabha member from Orissa, noted that the bill was, and I quote, "naturally meant for the 5 millions of Indians who live abroad, because these Indians did not meet the cultural standard that we naturally expect," end quote. Mohanty argued that rather than to make Indian citizenship available to these Indians, or in his words, "we should not make our citizenship so cheap," end quote, the bill should actually aim to resolve, and I quote, "any kind of double loyalty that which has been brought about due to the questions related to the citizenships of Indians overseas," end quote. Irrespective of how Indian leaders thought and formulated the rules of citizenship, Indians overseas and those in the partition regions thought about citizenship and belonging in particular ways. Often these did not align with the state's mandates. For example, most Indians overseas did not see a problem with having a dual nationality, a utilitarian concept for them, which would allow them to claim belonging while being outside the boundaries of territorial India. Thus, Popat, whose news came out last week, reflected that her father took a British passport because it allowed him to travel and have dual nationality as a British subject. An article in the Kenyan Weekly in 1953 urged Indians there to show their loyalty to the Indian Republic first. Another letter to the MEA from Tanganyika, which is present-day Tanzania, explained how Indians there had to initially take on British citizenship because it allowed for dual nationality, but then Indians subsequently wanted to register as citizens as they did not want to be deemed as foreigners in India. Similarly, Wadia and his legal team argued that Wadia could still be an Indian citizen while holding a British passport. However, these requests fell to deaf ears as the Indian state focused on citizenship based on territoriality, which included the important requirement of domicile. Let us get back briefly to Qamar Jamali, who claimed never to have gone to Pakistan. Local authorities in Patna alleged that he had actually gone to Pakistan in May 1952 and returned without any documentation back home in August of 1952. The fact that Jamali fled to Bombay once the Bihar authorities had ordered his arrest was taken to signal that such allegations had some basis. His arrest and subsequent order of deportation to Pakistan was challenged in court by his uncle, who filed a writ petition, claiming that Jamali was an Indian citizen. The Patna High Court dismissed the petition, upholding the deportation. He was deported in March of 1953. At this point, Jamali himself filed a petition to the Supreme Court of India, contesting the deporting rule of the Patna High Court. The story ends somewhat happily for Jamali. The Supreme Court ruled that his deportation had been unlawful given that he was an Indian citizen and he should be brought back home to India at the Indian government's expense. Citizenship for partitions displaced and Indians abroad taken together had a couple of things in common. The issue of divided loyalties, negotiations around belonging and territoriality, and most importantly, the right to mobility, that is to exit and entry, tested the parameters of new citizenship acts in the 1950s. I've tried to argue today like that these very commonalities between what is seemingly disparate groups of people help us understand the Indian state's difficulty in locating the quote unquote true Indian citizen. Such difficulties continue to impact contemporary debates around the CAA and its most recent amendment in 2019. The amendment confers a fast-track citizenship to non-Muslim communities, implying a particular understanding of refugee, which harks back to the 1950s. Simultaneously, it also revokes some of the rights of the overseas Indians, which places the OCI more closely with the status of a foreigner. Thank you.
Thank you very much for making such important connections between the different types of challenges which were faced, and the ones relating to partition and the ones relating to Indians overseas. And then, of course, linking up some of these by giving examples and also linking up with the recent debate about the Citizenship Amendment Act. So thank you very much. Now we are ready to take some questions. I think before we do that, I would invite the two panelists if they have questions and comments for each other, or they would like to initiate a discussion on the larger issues. And then meanwhile, you could send your questions to Winnie through the chat box.
Great. Thank you, Professor Ganesh. And I should say, Professor Roy, I've always been a fan. I think I read your book shortly after it came out, and was fascinated by the starting story that you narrate about that woman who got divorced and then had to fight the whole citizenship thing. I was wondering that considering you're very much you work on the concept of citizenship and its development in India, how far do you think is it really related to suspicion and this scare? You also mentioned in your work and also today, the question of loyalty. If India has existed, for a long time, if Indianness is so integral and ever present, that's one of the arguments. Then the question of loyalty should not be that precious, or should not be that scary that you have to go to this extreme lengths to ensure a very high level of loyalty. What does that say, therefore, to you in terms of how the Indian state is crafting an Indian citizen from the 1950s onwards? If you can, comment a little bit on that.
Sure, Yakub, and I must thank you for a wonderful review that you did of my book, if I remember correctly. Ever since I knew that you were on the panel, I meant to thank you. So I would definitely not say that India has existed from time immemorial, and these issues about suspicion and loyalty are definitely part of statecraft as nation states. And it's not an India-specific kind of phenomena, right? As in, if you think about state formation in the 1920s, post First World War, the ideas of who belongs and doesn't belong really come up. And you see a kind of documentary regime that's coming up in the Western world as well. And in that, you have questions about loyalty and suspicion. But in the case of India in the 1950s, as the nation state emerges, the question of loyalty then shifts to people who are deemed as minorities, people who are not fully citizens, right? As in, there's an assumption of automatic citizenship for those undivided parts of territorial India. So, but even within those, there are many cases of minority Muslims or Christians who are having to kind of deal with this idea of divided loyalty, right? And I'm not going to say that it emerges with the partition, because some of those ideas have a pre-partition connection, but it emerges within specific statecrafts within the debates of citizenship as to who can be part of this. And the question of loyalty is very, very ironic, given that this is something that you cannot actually prove, right? As in, how do you prove loyalty? As in, if you can join the Indian army or the Pakistani army and you would still be seen as, the most patriotic organization that I can think of at the moment, you could still be found disloyal. So I don't know if that answers some of, or at least gets you thinking on some of the answers.
Yeah, of course. Just a kind of like a footnote question, since you did mention the minorities. Do you feel that on average, this question is asked more of non-Hindus? Then, of course, there are Hindus where this question is asked, but do you think the assumption is always that it's easier for a Hindu to be an Indian than for a non-Hindu? Do you find that?
I would say in contemporary India, present-day India, definitely that would be the case. I think it was harder in the 1950s than it is today. And you have the same kind of, again, let's say, demands to prove belonging and citizenship in other places as well, where you have immigrant populations, say in the case of the United States, where you had the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 19th century. 1924, there's a major immigration act, which basically kind of discounts, and in the case of South Asian Americans, completely takes away their citizenship, because as in the argument is about race, but there's a question of loyalty as well.
Okay, we could now move on to some questions for Professor Bangash. So there are two questions. Why was the princely state of Kalat not ready to join Pakistan? And could you elaborate a bit on how it managed to do so in 1948? Then the second question. The problem of insurgency that Pakistan faces in Bangladesh, is it a legacy of this issue? And finally, what is one stark difference that you would like to mention between the manner of accession of princely states in India and Pakistan?
Okay, well, let me sort of begin in reverse order, because that's the easiest one, perhaps. The one big difference is the centrality of democratization as a sine qua non in India, as compared to that being kind of not really a consideration in Pakistan. Now that took place because the Congress was a popular political party, and the All India States People's Congress was quite active in a number of princely states. So it knew that if there are elections held in these princely states, the Congress will come to power. That was not the case in Pakistan, where the Muslim League was not really present in most princely states. And as I mentioned, even when a state's Muslim League was established, the central government very quickly went against it and repressed it, and in fact disbanded it within a couple of years. So the question of democratization is, I think, a very critical difference between the integration in India and Pakistan. The Bangladesh relation, of course, is, Bangladesh was, British India. So of course, that has very little to do with princely states. But now to the question of Kalat, that's a whole topic in itself. So I'll give a very, very short version of it. Kalat claimed that it wants to get into a treaty relationship with Pakistan and not to fully accede. Because one, Kalat claimed that it was not an Indian princely state, which was a misreading of history. It really was. And secondly, Kalat, but where I find Kalat to be very interesting is that one of the political leaders in Kalat actually asked the government of Pakistan and said, well, what's your rationale that you should join Pakistan? And they said, oh, because we are Muslim and you are Muslim. And this guy, Bazinjo, actually, spoke in the House of Commons in Kalat's state, and said, and I paraphrase a little bit from his speech, we said that if the only argument that we should join Pakistan is because we are Muslim and they are Muslim, then Iran should join Pakistan, Afghanistan should join Pakistan, because they're also Muslim countries. So there's really no reason for Kalat to join Pakistan, and they wanted to be friendly with Pakistan, but not really formally accede to it, because they were very scared of it. And also one must remember that up till the British, Kalat had a very tenuous relationship with India, and only for a short time under the Mughal Empire, it was really a part of India. Before that, after that, it was mainly under the Safavids of Iran, and then under an Afghan government, and then independent for a long time also. How did it accede to Pakistan? Well, the Khan of Kalat was very good friends with Jinnah, so didn't want to really say to Jinnah that I don't want to accede. He said, oh, my House of Lords and House of Commons don't agree, my Sardars, the local elders don't agree. So what the government of Pakistan did was quite simply went to the Sardars, offered them influence and money, and they all agreed. And the Khan of Kalat, by the end of it, was left with a small landlocked territory that was directly under his control. So he actually got screwed by his own words, so to speak. And of course, there was a threat that, if he tries to create trouble, there would be military action. But very quickly, as soon as he acceded, his younger brother, Prince Abdul Karim, actually raised the banner of revolt. So in June 1948, there was a revolt in Kalat, a very small one, but still was a revolt. And then, revolts have continued in the Baluchistan region based on this accession that a lot of people didn't accept. June 1948, October 1958, 1963 to 66, 73 to 77, and then from 2005 to 2011-12. So this question has continued for a very long time in Pakistan as a very critical question of integration.
Okay. There is a question about citizenship, and it is really about the recent report which came out just, I think, last week, which said that about 100,000 Indians have taken up foreign citizenship. And many of these have gone to Australia, America, Canada, which are the top destinations. But there are also some African countries. So, is it possible to think about what reasons could have led Indians to think about getting citizenship in third world countries?
Sure. So yes, I think the report refers to 2021 being one of the peak times. I think it came out of the MEA, which says that this was the year when a lot more Indians gave up their passports, right? Because India does not allow dual nationality. And of course, one of the automatic reasons that we can think of is economic, right? As in economically, Australia, Canada, the United States are destinations for immigration. But there are other reasons as well. And several countries in Africa have, especially Eastern Africa, have a diasporic Indian population. So some of it could be in terms of, kind of solidifying that familial connection. Some of the African countries are actually doing pretty well. So that is something. So we should not kind of think of the entire continent as one that we have kind of inherited in terms of knowledge as poor and backward and things like that. So, and there could be some, maybe a minute portion of that number who no longer see India as a viable place for freedom of speech or for really the way India has now kind of moved away from its secular principles to see that as one of the reasons. I think somewhere I read in terms of New Zealand, which ranks pretty high in terms of freedom of the press, as one of the places where Indians have taken up residences and citizenship, and they have cited freedom of press as one of the reasons amongst many for taking citizenship. there.
Okay, thank you. So I have a, another question for Professor Bangash. Why did not Pakistan resist when India started the annexation of Junagar? So could you please give some could you briefly elaborate on the situation of Junagar at the time of partition, or just after partition?
Sure, thanks. So in my estimation, the only reason why Pakistan accepted the accession of Junagar was the fact that Junagar was in kind of an opposite case to Kashmir. Junagar had a Muslim ruler, but a Hindu majority population. Kashmir had a Hindu ruler, but a Muslim majority population. And Pakistan thought that if India were to apply the principle in saying, well, they're a Hindu majority and they want to join India, and therefore it should join in India, the opposite should apply in the case of Kashmir. And that's really the only reason why Pakistan accepted the accession. And I've recently been editing the memoir of the first defense secretary of Pakistan, Sikandar Mirza, who ended up being the governor general and also the first president of Pakistan. And he very clearly says that he went up to the prime minister and said that this is a ridiculous thing. And the prime minister actually told him that, they want to create that, they want to highlight the principle. But then, as usual in international politics, might is right. So India occupied Junagar and also went into Kashmir. That principle really didn't make any sense. And I think a very physical manifestation of that is also that when things were getting really bad in Junagar, Pakistan only sent telegrams of support, never even sent a single army man to Junagar to defend it.
Yeah, thank you. So we are, we have a few more minutes. May I have one question, which is really about the integration in a more comparative context. So this is a counterfactual question for Professor Bangash. If the one unit scheme, because the one unit scheme of 1955 had not come about, and of course, there were reasons why the one unit scheme had to be introduced due to the failure of the constitution and kind of a political consensus to emerge and so on. So if that had not, that one unit order had not been imposed, could the princely states have had a different trajectory? Because
yes, of course.
Yes, because
sorry.
Yeah, so on. Go ahead, please go ahead.
No, you saying something.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah.
You go ahead. It's fine.
Of course, and the as I said, the frontier princely states did continue till 1969. Swadhi, Chitral, and
Yes.
And the Hunza and Nagar continued until 1973. So they continued way past the Indian.
But those are states of exception in a sense.
Yes. And I think these would have continued, and in fact would have done much better. One of the things why I think the whole argument that the Punjab dominates and all of that is because of the fact that, of course, not only is Punjab large, but with the addition of Bahawalpur, state became even larger. So that would have actually kind of created an impetus for the Punjab not to take over to that extent. Secondly, I think the existence of smaller units, and therefore I really gave the example of Khairpur state, which is now just a district in Sindh.
Right.
That would have given, I think, heart to the government of Pakistan, saying that smaller units aren't bad. There is this great centralizing kind of a force in Pakistan that's been there since day one. And I think the existence of the princely states would have kind of tempered that to some extent. And a lot of the princely states were actually pretty successful at the smaller level. Swat in the frontier was an exemplary state. Chitral did reasonably well. Khairpur did really, really well. Bahawalpur also did reasonably well. So, there were successes there. And I think if they'd continued, things would have been consolidated there. And in fact, if the Khan of Kalat had continued in some ways in Balochistan, maybe the insurgency would not have happened again. But, that's all a maybe.
Sure. So what I was saying is that, this comparative dimension is very interesting between India and Pakistan. And of course, you highlighted some of the key elements of that in terms of centralization of power. Whereas in the Indian context, the key date is 1956, when the Part C states were abolished. In fact, the princely order was abolished. And not only was that abolished, but also the whole office of the Raj Pramukh was abolished. So the princely, the bigger princely states like Mysore, Patiala were allowed to serve as governors, and that office was titled Raj Pramukh, and they were abolished. So what is happening in the Indian context is really the devolution of power, which is really the states through states reorganization. There is this process of integration, but also devolution of power and recognizing the diversity, the language and culture and regional identities of different regions. So it's a very interesting context, but this whole period is fascinating between 1947 and the mid-50s. So we are running, may I invite both of you to give us a small takeaway. What is a theoretical takeaway which you would like participants to go back about your individual themes? So could I request Professor Roy to go first, and then Professor Bangash, and then we will conclude with that.
So one of the takeaways that I want the audience to have is to suggest that the issues of citizenship that is kind of going on right now in India stem back to the 1950s. Some of it was resolved, some of it were new ideas that are coming up between 1950 and Indians. I think conceptually what we really need to think about is India without borders, and then think about how citizenship can continue to be debated even when you don't have a territorial kind of connection or territorial location. So that's what I want us to kind of think about.
Thank you. Over to you, Professor Bangash.
I think one of the key takeaways here is that I think one should not simplistically understand the history of both India and Pakistan through the lens of British India. That was split on the 15th of August. There was a lot more happening at that time. I think that's a very important consideration, because it's just taken over by whatever happened in British India and under British control. The second thing is also not to dismiss what happened in the princely states. These were state formations that went back over 1,000 years in some cases, and to say that the nation states both in India and Pakistan were should hold primacy over them is, I think, a very charged kind of a statement. And the last thing that I think, taking the long view, which is very important in saying that how actually things became a lot more contested and a lot more questions, just in the case of, as Professor Roy was talking about, citizenship and, loyalty and everything. At some level, the empire was a lot more open and inclusive in some ways, and the states themselves were a lot more inclusive in the sense people were going in and out and what things were happening than what followed in all these new nation states, and they became more controlling of their citizens and became very excited about how to kind of regulate them and create this this kind of documentary thing. And the very last bit is that current questions relate to them. Again, the insurgencies in the northeast of India, in Pakistan also very much relate to the princely states. So these are not some things that ended in 1956 in India or a bit later in Pakistan, but are still continuing conversations that I think we must have.
Sure. Thank you so much. So on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this session. And I would like to thank both the participants, including Professor Sajal Nag, who is not here, but who also made a wonderful presentation. So we've had some very interesting issues which have come up, which have been discussed. And we hope that the conversations will continue. So I would like to thank all the panelists and all the participants for joining us today. And please take note that tomorrow there are 2 roundtables at different timings. The program is with you. So please remember to join them. And on that note, have a good night for those of you who are in Singapore, and a good day for those who are in other geographies. Amit, thank you very much. And Winnie, thank you very much. so we could bring this session to a close.
Thank you.
And thank you also, especially
Thank you.
lovely to be here with you.
Very nice to connect.